Hi everybody! Today we're going to learn about the runes that the Vikings used to write a long time ago. What is a rune? The Viking alphabet. Today in school we learn how to read and write using the alphabet, a series of 26 letters that match up with sounds to make words. The Vikings in ancient Scandinavia did the same thing, only their alphabet looked very different from ours. Instead of the ABCs, the Vikings wrote using runes. The original Viking alphabet had 24 runes and was called the Futhark. Basically, each rune is like a letter, and the Futhark is like an alphabet. Here you can see the 24 runes that made up the Futhark. The Futhark varied a little bit from place to place, but in general, this is what the runes looked like in Scandinavia as early as the 1st century CE, 2,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found about 350 inscriptions written in the oldest version of the Futhark. Most of them are from Scandinavia, or Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, but some of them have been found as far away as the Black Sea, around Turkey, Bulgaria, and Russia. It might not seem like that far today, but in a time when the only way to travel was by foot, horse, or boat, the distance was huge. This is evidence that the Vikings traveled far away from their homes in search of treasure and adventure. If we take a closer look at the runes now, you might notice that there are some runes that stand for sounds that aren't represented in our alphabet, like th or ng, and that there are some modern letters and sounds that aren't represented in the Futhark, like C, Q, V, X, Y, and Z. That's because the Vikings spoke a different language than we do today, and those letter sounds were not a part of that language. For example, where we use the letter C today, the Vikings would have just used an S or a K, depending on what sound they needed. The Vikings who were writing in runes in the early medieval period did not have access to paper or pens. Instead, they had to carve runes into easily available surfaces, like wood, bone, and stones, with a knife or stylus. The reason why the runes are so small and made up of short straight lines is that it is incredibly hard to carve curvy lines into these hard surfaces. That being said, even straight lines are not terribly easy to carve into rocks, so messages written in runes that archaeologists have found are usually pretty short. The ones that are not short are usually talking about important kings and events, so it makes sense that the writers would be willing to spend more time writing about those things. The Yelling stones are two very famous runestones that do just that. Let's take a closer look at them. The runestones were discovered at Yelling, a town in Denmark. The first and smaller runestone, pictured here, was placed by King Gorm of Denmark, in honor of his wife Thera a few years after she died. In modern English it reads, King Gorm made these monuments in memory of Thera, his wife, Denmark's adornment. The second larger one was placed many years later by his son, King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Norway, to celebrate the lives of his parents as well as his success in battle during his time as king. Unlike manuscripts or books that were being made at this time, these runestones have survived the elements for over 1,000 years, simply because they were made from stone and not materials like parchment or wax. Even though the Vikings used runes for a period of over 1,000 years, they eventually adopted the alphabet that we use today. As they moved around and began to settle down outside their home countries of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, they had access to parchment and inks that had been in use in other parts of Europe for generations. However, not only did they adopt new writing materials when they left Scandinavia, they began to also use the Latin alphabet, or the alphabet that we know and use in English today. Iceland especially became known throughout Northern Europe for some of its most important storytellers and writers. People living in Iceland believed it was very important to write a detailed record of the lives of its people and government, so we have a whole bunch of sources that are written in the Old Norse language, but in the Latin alphabet. Think of it as though you wrote a story in English, but then wrote the same story in French. You'd be writing in two different languages using the same alphabet. Old Norse was the opposite. While the spoken language did not change, the written records shifted from the runes of the Futhark to letters of the alphabet. Even though the written language changed, some exceptions were made. Two runes, thorn and win for example, can be found in texts from England hundreds of years after the Latin alphabet began to be used. On this slide you can see an example of a thorn character used in a famous Middle English poem, The Canterbury Tales. It was written hundreds of years after the Vikings stopped using only runes to write. Over time these runes were dropped from the English alphabet. In some languages, like modern Icelandic, this symbol is still a part of the written language, so the Viking runic legacy has not disappeared completely. In summary, the Vikings used runes for centuries to write down messages and inscriptions about the people and events in Scandinavia. Eventually, the Vikings adopted the alphabet we use today, but in a few modern languages, some of the ancient runes of the Futhark snuck into the alphabet and are still in use today alongside the ABCs that we know and love. Thanks for listening.